Okay, well, I forgot I can use my tablet for vlogs. I need some sleep. Well, if it wasn't for the Ford Taurus having almost the exact same useless rear window as my 71 Barracuda did, you can see that there's an ambulance behind us, about a car back. It's my ambulance now. I just bought a 1992 Chevy, I think it's a G30 ambulance with, it's a Chevrolet, basically Chevy van, what they call it. I forget the name of the company that makes the ambulances, but it's Leader Manufacturing, which specializes in emergency medical transportation vehicles. It's got 30,000 miles, which is ridiculous. It's was non-medical transport for Loma Linda Medical Center in Redlands, which is kind of a trip because my mom and dad were both in the Marine Corps, and my mom is still alive, and she goes to the VA hospital, Loma Linda VA hospital, and I've been to Loma Linda Medical Hospital and the university several times. I got all my dental work when I was younger at the dental university, so I had students overseeing, well, actually a teacher overseeing the students working on my teeth. So they still okay, they still all right. But anyways, I'd always wanted an ambulance just because the business that I have. Some people who know who I am and know me personally know that I've wanted an ambulance for my business. So I saw it on one of the websites that sells all kinds of stuff, and actually a buddy of mine sent me the link to it, and he knew I was looking for an ambulance. I'd had a van for a while that I sold. There was the same basic truck. It was a 95 with a 454 big block, which is really the only reason I didn't like it, because they ate a lot of gas. It had about 100,000 miles on it, and I'd gotten it from LA Power and Water, so it had 100,000 miles on it. I sold it basically for the same price I just bought this entire ambulance for. And yeah, they had the ambulance advertised for $1,700. I gave them $1,500, and they're delivering it for me. So they're following me right now to the shop, and it is a complete, total, functional, except for the light bar and I think the siren, but everything else is in the ambulance that it was used when it was in service. Oh, it doesn't have the gurney. I'm gonna have to get a gurney, because that's gonna go along with the theme of it being my service truck from this point on. But I mean, it has all the flashing lights, all the interior components, has an oxygen tank in it, has a CO2 tank, has a oxygen generator. I believe it has a propane tank in it to run the oxygen generator. If it doesn't, no big deal, I can get one. Has dual interstate batteries mounted under the driver's side. I think it still has a motor battery in it, but it has an apparatus switch with two different positions. Has ventilation, has decks, compartments, a PA for talking to the passenger compartment in the back. So when the driver is coming up on some traffic, or maybe getting close to a place where someone in the back is concentrating on normally keeping somebody alive, but with this, what's nice, I never wanted an ambulance. I did want an ambulance, but I didn't actually want to own an ambulance. And why did I want an ambulance but didn't want to own an ambulance? Well, because ambulances have had people die in them. Ambulances have people bleed to death in them. Ambulances have had people do any number of things. I already deal with that with the police cars I have. Now, I was going to buy a hearse, and when I say hearse, the ambulance I was going to want to get was going to be like the station wagon style ambulance. I wanted to get an older one like the Ghostbusters ambulance, but those are impossible to get because they're worn out, for one, before they get bought. Two, they haven't made that type of ambulance in a long time. So the only other options I had was a Class C, I call it, type ambulance, which would have the big box on the back and a van front end or a pickup truck front end. I'm going to turn the music on. So, or just get a van ambulance. Well, what sucks about the van is you can't really do anything else with it. It's not a pickup truck. You can't just throw stuff into the back or have something larger than what the cargo area could handle that's not covered. Which brings me back to the actual station wagon ambulance. Those have a lot more flair to them, what I like to say. Because having something that looks like the Ghostbusters ambulance would be really cool with my theme of what I wanted to use it for my business. So the problem is that trying to get a decent car that wasn't wore out. I guess the old school ambulances ever since Ghostbusters came out have just been ridiculously expensive to get, even torn up. Then I considered, well, a lot of companies who made ambulances also made hearses. And at first it kind of creeped me out a little bit, and I'm kind of sadistic about some things. I do like I like Halloween, I like all the skeletons, I like horror movies. Sinister vehicles look kind of cool, like, you know, say The Car, the movie from The Car, if you're not familiar with it. It's just this black evil car that was driven by like the devil or some demonic spirit. There was the cars that were on Death Proof, that Quentin Tarantino movie. They had a Nova and a Charger. They were all jet black with like a skull on the hood. So you'd think I'd be okay almost immediately with a hearse. But I thought, you know, it's dead people, hearse, dead people, you know. But then I thought about it. Okay, a hearse has people who have already died. They're at peace. They're going to their resting place, okay? Just those three words. Peace, resting place, and hearse. It's like the hearse word kind of throws it out of proportion. But ambulance, trauma, death, and nobody's bled out in a hearse. Nobody's died in a hearse unless they had a coronary while they were driving because they heard something make a noise in the back. There's a joke about that. I'm going to have to tell that one day. An ambulance has been driven with urgency. You know, ambulance and urgent are almost like the same word when it comes to emergency and ambulance. It's like they're synonymous with each other. You never see a hearse hauling ass unless it's like in a redneck demolition derby race or, I don't know, on a movie where somebody's getting chased down by an evil hearse. But when it comes down to it in the real world, a hearse is a lot more sanitary, not even physically sanitary. I mean, when it comes to your soul, you know, when you have a vehicle, okay, you consider a vehicle as like your next most significant investment to your house, okay? House is the biggest investment you're ever going to make, and your vehicle is the second, okay? If you buy a house that people died in, okay, haunted house, that's where that comes from. If you buy a house that happened to belong to a funeral home, which a lot of funeral homes were houses that got converted into funeral homes by the family who owned the house, who decided to make a funeral home out of it. I would rather live in a house that was a funeral home than a house that maybe was a hospital or an emergency room or even a resting home, because resting homes, people plan on dying there. People are taken there with the intent of dying. So when it comes down to it, an ambulance is kind of like a resting home or an emergency room, and a hearse is like a funeral home. I mean, flowers, nice words, calm respects, peace, and setting someone to rest. So I always thought, well, I'll get a hearse. Most ambulance companies that made the ambulances that I wanted made hearse because they were the same cars. And honestly, the last car I looked at that was a hearse was a police. It was made by a company that was supposed to be a police ambulance, and it became a funeral procession presidential hearse. Speaking of which, I see one going by, a black hearse right now that's actually a Mercedes one. How funny. So this one that I looked at, which is for a presidential type, well, I don't know if it's necessarily presidential, but it was made for official processions, and it was a hearse, but it was considered what they call a flower car, which they used to make a big El Camino type of vehicle back in the 40s and 50s that was made by Cadillac, and it was basically the same size as what you'd see as a station wagon or a limo that had the bigger back end, and it was open and it had the flowers, and you would even have a coffin in it and the flowers would be around it, but it'd be out exposed to the weather. The reason for an actual hearse came about because there was a necessity for, regardless of the weather, the casket could be taken to its point of final resting. So you couldn't always have this open vehicle. So they would still have a flower car, and they would have a hearse separate, which was to make sure that the coffin wasn't in the rain or in the weather. So this last car I looked at was an actual official. It had lights and sirens. It actually had pop-up lights that came out from under the dashboard. I gotta plug in one of my phones here. Ooh, it's stuck. So it was actually designed for probably high up members, either in the service or maybe in the, I don't know, maybe for somebody who was in the Secret Service who died or worked for the president, who knows. But it was still kind of thrashed. But at least it wasn't made for 911 calls being run into the ground and chasing down the closest possible place to get a person to save their lives. So, rewind back to this ambulance that's following me. This is a non-emergency medical transport ambulance. And I'm not talking about that ambulance the non-emergency transport that you see that's just a regular Dodge Caravan with the lift and lower suspension and just has, your average schmo driving it, taking somebody in a wheelchair from dialysis to home, and then maybe stopping at the mini mart on the way. This is actually an ambulance that was designed for non-emergency transport from hospital to hospital. So it did have a light bar, it did have a siren. Most of the lights are amber on it. It has all the equipment to maintain life and comfort, but it's not to save a life. It's to transport someone who is probably in one hospital and needs to be sent to a hospital with some different type of care or even different type of coverage. If you end up getting a ride in an ambulance in an emergency situation to the closest hospital and you've got a medical plan that doesn't cover the particular hospital you're going to, then you need to be able to get transported to a hospital that's in your network. This is the vehicle. So highly doubt that this vehicle has had anybody bleed to death or die in it. I'm not saying it hasn't, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't. So, but we're at the shop, so I'm gonna go ahead and tell you thanks for watching and find a place to park a damn ambulance. Go figure.